Good morning, Joe Winberg, Bluebird Semaphore, maybe. Uh, Back again with World History, and this would be World History 17. And I'm going to start being just some comments first. Is that after a considerable amount of looking into history, it's starting to become clearer and clearer to me that history is nothing more than the narrative of masses and masses of people all over the planet, all over the earth, all the people in mass running around trying to get stuff. The history of the world could be related, it could be called Stuff and the Getting of Stuff. That's what they did, that's what they do, and that's what they will always do. Humans want stuff. And it actually starts to get boring reading about their little plans and actions that they've gone through. This would be the human beings all over the globe to get stuff. But that being said, I want to get back to the Far East. And it's very convenient for me because the Far East is also playing into why the war in the Pacific became the war in the Pacific. So by looking into the Far East, of course I'm going to have to look into Japan, which I have been doing. And I come to find that Japan has been doing maritime piracy for probably over 500 years, if not 1,000. But that was one of Japan's big ways of getting stuff, was to go a pirating along the China coast. And we're talking primarily directly across Japan, that part of China's coast, and probably more so southeast of Japan, which puts us right in the theater of the war in the Pacific. So when I try to find out why the war in the Pacific became the war in the Pacific, well, I'm coming to the show a little late because Japan has been doing this for centuries. And then what I also find out, which leads to why we have had that war, is that Japan was essentially a fairly militaristic country. For a rather small island nation, it could, and it did, put together armies of up to 230,000 men. That's a considerable freaking army. Even the Mongols, whatever they were called, the Mongols, hardly reached that number. The typical number was more, even with China, was more like 130, maybe 160,000. But 230,000 is a large number, and they squeezed that army into that tiny little island nation. So, once again, the history of Japan is just this top guy having war against that other top guy, all of them trying to be the top guy, all of them deposing the current top guy and getting a new top guy. Hundreds and hundreds and centuries, right up to the beginning of World War II. That's what they did. They were a warrior-like people, although when push comes to shove, they rarely triumphed, in the final analysis. Eventually they had to pull out of Korea in the times they took over Korea. Eventually they had to pull out of China when they invaded and led the Chinese in a Japanese fashion. They put their people in the municipalities and ran this board and that board, making it all look very Japanese. But they couldn't finish the fight. They had to pull out. Same thing, of course, with World War II. They couldn't finish the fight. It was over. So this is a classic example of grandiose thinking, megalomaniacs all over the place. And I always, and I'm very consistent about this, is that if a people were like a certain way hundreds of years ago, you can bet your bottom dollar they're still like that today. Maybe camouflaged, but deep down inside, that's who they are. And I'm not pulling back from that. And this is for all the nations on this planet. You know, at one time there was unconcealed warfare. It wasn't veiled. They went at each other tooth and nail, and so on and so forth. That's who they are. Just for example, the other day I picked up a book and I landed in Aberdeen, Scotland. And what do I find out? The history of Aberdeen, Scotland, by the way, big granite stone making nation or city-state, northeast Scotland. And they have the first or the second largest granite building in the world. Some college that became a university that's now serving multiple functions. But first thing I read is here's Robert the Bold, I think it was. Or Robert the something. And I mean, there it is. And I'm reading approximately at least 100 years of internal warfare. You know, inside Scotland and between Scotland and England. You know, without even their major product is forestry or something. No, right away, boom, they're killing each other. That's what people do. They kill each other. And and like I said, this has been a long-standing way for me to look at the world. Is that humans are essentially very aggressive animals. Long before I even thought about history, I thought about anthropology. And what do we know about that? We know that the apes that we're from are super aggressive animals, you know? And that's who we are. You know, we survived in the savannas because we were aggressive. We could kill off the other predators. Now, all that being said, one of the things I came across for all my life, I've always been thinking in terms of the inland sea when we talk about Japan. I just assumed that they were talking about the Sea of Japan. You know, I mean, it's a fairly small sea between China and Japan, so I always figured that was the inland sea, but it isn't. It's actually a body of water between two of the larger islands. And so when I started looking at that, I said, oh, wow, I've actually been there. And I was, there's a U.S. Navy's got rights to a naval seaport, I think it's Sasebo. And from somewhere in there, we got into the inland sea and we let ourselves out at the very western terminus of the inland sea that punctures the Sea of Japan. And that's very, very tight there. I mean, it was almost like we could touch either side of that crevice that enabled us to get, you could get from the Atlantic on the east side, go all the way through and come out on the other side. And that's not the Atlantic, come on. The Pacific, the very western Pacific, you could come in there on the east side and then go through and come out the Sea of Japan, which I thought was noteworthy, and I wanted to pass that along. So if you're studying Japan, you have a clearer idea of this, the way that island nation is set up. I mean, they claim that there's basically 5 major islands, which is, I'm sure, the fact, but there's literally hundreds and thousands of other small islands all over the place. And these, the islands were governed in the typical ruling class model, although the ruling class might change from one generation to the other, but mostly there were hereditary lines from one ruler in class, one rulers of this piece of land to the other. Now, eventually, the civilization in Japan became feudal-like, not unlike the feudalism we had in Western Europe, with vassals beholding to their lords and the knights beholding to the vassals and that kind of stuff. There was a little less, I believe, of the chivalry because, A, women were allowed to be warriors too. So it wasn't as chivalrous as the feudal system in Europe. But it certainly was, all about the crazed idea that I will do anything for my Lord, including falling on my sword and disemboweling myself. If that's Harry or what that is, I think that's the name they call it, which means cutting out the stomach. But totally, in my estimation, just insanity. Why does this other individual, warrant your undivided loyalty that you'll kill yourself for him? Nobody on the planet deserves that. But that's what they did. And, I'm not excusing the other Far East countries, China, Korea, but I think of the three, Korea was the less into warfare type, and whatever they had was smallish. Obviously, it's the smallest country. And China seemed to have an awful lot of that inter-regional warfare, killing 100,000, 200,000 at a whack. But in the meantime, always going after stuff. They always wanted stuff. And at some point, the West gets into these countries, and then you start to get a whole new story, because the West is introducing them to certain ideas of technology, art, and economics, warfare, and they're wanting to learn this stuff. But one thing is clear, that China, perhaps unlike Japan and Korea, was always willing to wait. They would wait out their enemies, and then when the time was right, they'd crush them. I think that's always been their philosophy since day one. Historically, day one is 2000 BC, 1700 BC. But, they didn't, China does not like to waste its resources. When they see that they could win and win significantly, then they'll go to war. But, Japan was ready to, you get insulted and they have a war. I don't know how quickly Korea was set to go to war, but one of the things I'm starting to fantasize is that North Korea is North Korea today, because historically the Koreans always wanted to differentiate themselves from everybody else. That's who they were. They were this unique people. And after World War II, a certain element of that society said, hey, we don't want to go down the road of the rest of the world. We want to stay Koreans. But that put them at odds with a lot of people. And I also believe that during World War II, they were fighting on the side of the Chinese communist guerrillas. So there was a certain tendency to go that route anyway. But I do believe, and based on the Michael Palin, and I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, the guy from Monty Python, he went to North Korea recently, and I'm seeing people who want to stay unique and who want to be themselves. Now, listen, I'm not arguing we support totalitarianism. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying what I saw, and of course I'm going to see this through a prism of some sort that they let Michael Palin see, Palin. But it's a people who want to look like Koreans, which you can't say that about South Korea. South Korea looks like the West, just like Japan looks like the West, and all these countries. with their steel skyscrapers and their super duper trains and everything else. They look like us. But there's one thing I wanted to say which I thought was important, but I'm forgetting it. That the Koreans, this, that, and in the meantime, we have Japan, and the introduction of the European and the West to the Far East is such a major world history fact and a world history game changer. It's hard to deny its importance. The Dutch in 19 or something penetrate. They get something, I believe, on Sumatra, maybe Java, and it goes from there. You know, yes, the Portuguese were in the Spice Islands way before this, 100 years before this, or 75 years. And although spice was an extremely valuable commodity, it doesn't have the gravitas of, say, timber resources or others. I want to think of the coconut oil, eventually the rubber, and then tea, and then of course the creme de la creme, oil. Tea was very big, you know, and all the Far East countries drank tea. Of course, the West didn't until it was introduced to them from the East. And Japan, of course, made an art of the tea ceremony. I think I recently read of one of their rulers, and their rulers get different names. Sometimes they're called shoguns, sometimes they're called daimyos, whatever. I like to just refer to it as the ruling class, and then it would be the big guy of the ruling class. You know, a ruling class is, to me, the best way to verbalize and make a noun of the group of people who run the world. You know, you want to call them many other names they're given, but it's just simple, ruling class. That's what they do. They rule, and everything is set in motion by the ruling class. So the ruling class in Japan, one of them had a tea ceremony. I think he had 500 people at this tea ceremony. And you gotta laugh when you think of what these things are. You know, they set the people aside in certain ways. You gotta pour the tea, and the simpler the clay bowl is, the better it is. You know, somehow that's more aesthetically pleasing. And then after they're done with this big ritual, they all sit around and they discuss the merits of the very simple bowls that they're drinking of. Can you just imagine how little these people had to do with their lives? This is, of course, the ruling class. You know, that they're going to sit around and talk about some abrasive clay bowl and its aesthetic properties. I see the sun is getting in my eyes. Isn't that beautiful? A morning sun. God bless the morning sun. And that some people who live in the crowded, urban, mass, filthy places can someday get to see it. I'm annoyed. I'm annoyed at a lot of things right now. Not the least of is the political aspect of this virus thing that's going on. Okay, I'm going to shut down for now. Nice having